Okay, in this lecture, we're going to look at the Periclean building program in Athens from approximately 447 until 412 BC. Format, most of these buildings are up on the Acropolis, and the format of the building program was to sort of create a monumental background for the great Panathenaic procession. The Panathenaic festival was something that Pisidides had developed and had tried to promote to the level of the other great sanctuary festivals, Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, and um, Isthmia. It achieved some level of renown in that regard. It was ultimately performed semi-annually. And there was a great procession that would come from the Agora up to the religious precincts of the Acropolis, a whole parade of Athenians to put a new peplos on the statue of Athena, Polia, for example, in the Erechtheion. So that's the sort of format, and what he did was embellish the Acropolis, having left it destroyed deliberately since the Persian War, to accommodate this national event. And we'll go quickly now through the building. So there are two, three, four major buildings that we tend to focus on. There is the Propylaea, the entrance gates to the Acropolis itself. It was built very rapidly in a 10-year period, completed by 432 BC. The Temple of Athena Nike, a small temple begun to commemorate the victory over the Persians and completed in 420 BC. The Parthenon, the Temple of Athena Parthenos, to replace the destroyed Hecatompedon, or the old Temple of Athena destroyed by the Persians. This was completed in 432 BC. The Erechtheion, a very complicated temple complex. It was to sort of commemorate earlier sanctuaries dedicated to Athena and Poseidon, but also recalling the great Bronze Age king of Athens, where supposedly situated where his tomb had been, Erechtheus, and this was constructed by 406 BC. In the Agora, the Temple of Hephaestus, in the Agora we already mentioned, this was completed by 415 BC. Other buildings he did in Athens, the Odeon, near the Theater of Dionysus, the embellishment of the Theater of Dionysus itself, the Temple of Poseidon at Sunion, and the Telesterion at the Sanctuary of Demeter and Persephone. Here is the Propylaea, the entrance gates. It's sort of two porticos facing a main gate that led into the Acropolis. In the upper left, we have a historical, an artist's reconstruction. Notice the fortifications out in front as well. The Acropolis was a citadel, after all, as well as a religious center. So here we see the two porticos in the plan. Ultimately, this became, and you can see the remains of them there in the lower left. We're looking at the propylaea from the interior of the Acropolis as well. This is the main gate into the city. It became kind of a museum. They like to store famous paintings up here. So you could come up here and gaze at some of the great paintings as well. In the lower left, you can see the remains of lots of blocks and things, and the cuttings on the. You have to assume the entire layout of the Acropolis was developed, laid down, paneled, and developed. One of the things we know is that they kept all the decrees of the democracy up here. So there was a whole forest of these stele, inscribed stele, that lawyers would go up to consult before assembly meetings. Right there on a pedestal on a porch right out in front of the uh, um, uh, south of the Propylaea is the small Temple of Athena Nike. Unlike most of the building program, and I need to stress this, of Pericles, it was a rapidly built program, and it used a very kind of simple Doric style of entablature, or the decorative motive. So Doric styles has these large echinus cushion-like capitals, these kind of cushion-like, pillow-like see with the Propylaea. Whereas here, with the Temple of Athena, Nike, we're using these Ionic entablature, these curling scrolls, is sort of the scrolled up leaves of an acanthus plant, and Ionic columns tend to be fluted, whereas Doric maybe not necessarily. Here is a piece of relief in the upper left of the Battle of Plataea, commemorating the Battle of Plataea. the war against the Persians. The most famous of all the buildings of Pericles was the Temple of Athena Parthenos, or the Parthenon itself. This great temple, again, converted into a church and then later into the headquarters of the Turkish governor. There was even a mosque built on the interior at one point, and so it has survived antiquity. The architects Ictinus and Callicrates, and the sculptor Phidias, the great sculptor of Pericles. It employs a number of methods. It is a Doric style temple, but it does things, for example, it employed, the architects were very skilled with optical effect and how your eye tends to distort straight lines and things like this. So it employed entasis. All of the columns actually swell toward the lower middle to offset the tendency of optical illusions in that regard. And the basement foundation of it actually rises in the middle a few centimeters, so it curls to offset the kind of, all of this was to offset the obvious sort of ponderous look of previous Doric architecture and make it lighter and sort of more dynamic, shall we. And Phidias, will look at his sculpture in a moment. Some other things about here we can see it was a marble roof temple, like the temple of um, Zeus at Olympia. I think there's only about 6 temples in the world that had marble roofs as opposed to tile roofs. It was very expensive to produce marble roofs, but the marble, if the tiles were made thin enough, sunlight could come through it and create a kind of diaphanous of sunlight within the interior at the same. The entablature was arranged where the architrave along the edge had metopes and triglyphs. You can see the triglyphs and the straight lines, and then the metopes were another area for reliefs. And so we have various mythological stories of Athens being performed in the there. And then the whole thing may have been painted over. They did find pigmentation in some of the remains, and so here's just an artist's representation of what it might have looked like with the coloration. Light pastel colors is what. The pediments of these gabled roofs lent themselves to high relief, so relief projecting from the wall of the pediment. And so on each end, there is a story being told. On the eastern end, the sun side end, the main entrance, it faces the east to catch the sunlight in the morning. We have the birth of Athena. She supposedly burst fully grown from the head of Zeus there at Olympia. And you're looking at this, there she is suddenly, and Zeus and Poseidon and all these gods are backing off, shocked at the sudden appearance of this god. The other side showed the competition between Athena and Poseidon for the right to be the patron deity of Athens. Poseidon offered command of the sea, Athena offered olives, and Athenians' olive oil was absolutely celebrated in the ancient world as the greatest of the olive oils. Here again is another artist reconstruction of what it might have looked like, fully embellished. Also, by this point, shields were put up. These were dedicated by Alexander the Great. Shields were taken from the Battle of the Granicus River. One of the interesting features of this, you've got this angular for the sculpture. And what do you do when you get down to the eaves? And so we can see how Phidias arranged the sculpture to accommodate the space by having them kind of lie down by the end. So on the upper right, you have this is the birth of Athena. She's off in the center. But here we have Dionysus, the drunken god, holding his wine glass and looking off in the opposite direction, completely oblivious to the birth of Athena behind him. In addition to the peristyle, behind that we have the building itself, what's known as the cella. And on the architrave of the cella, Phidias, in situ, he had scaffolding, carved the famous relief of the Panathenaic procession. So here we can see blocks of this relief. Art historians have suggested there were as many as 40 different hands at work in these reliefs. So Phidias and his graduate students were busily working this. And it portrays the march itself, the procession to the Acropolis. It goes all the way around the cella. Many of these are the blocks of relief that were stolen by Lord Elgin and taken to the British Museum, which is where you have to see them today. Inside the cella, inside the main thing, we have the icon of the goddess. So it faced the east. They have determined that there may have been a reflecting pool of water before the statue itself. So when you open the doors, the sunlight would come in and ricochet off the water and hit the statue, this 40-foot tall ivory and gold statue of Athena holding Nike for victory. One of the arguments, we're not really sure it was roofed. It may have been an open cella, just the statue. All this designed by Phidias. Moving to, this should have been, yes, it is labeled. This is the Erechtheion. This is a complex building with several sort of porches facing in different directions. Again, one of it accommodated the olive tree, sacred olive tree of Athens, and the archaeologists planted an olive tree right there before the building. One porch was for Poseidon, and his sanctuary, and then another one was for Erechtheus, himself. Complex building. Most famous for its porch of the caryatids. These are women carrying the building the way they would carry water jugs on their heads to the fountain in the agora to get water for their households. And here's a artist's reconstruction of what it might have looked like at its peak. So this is the great Periclean building program of the classical era in Athens.